Hi, Graham. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Federico. Nice to see you again.
I'm particularly happy to have you here today. Graham is the head of EMEA operation for Heirloom, and Heirloom is a company which has a significant reputation in the legacy modernization field. This is a field that I find particularly interesting, and I think you can give us some very interesting insights. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, very welcome. Right.
And can you start telling a few words about you, please?
Yeah. So as you say, I'm running EMEA for Heirloom Computing. I've got pretty much a software finance background. I live and work in Switzerland, and I've worked for most of the banks in Switzerland at one time or another in private banking, investment banking, and also general retail in various technical roles. And I've also I worked as a CTO of a hedge fund doing high volume, high frequency trading. Pretty varied background, but generally finance related. And before that, I used to work for a company called Microfocus in the early 90s, who were obviously, the big people in the migration space and legacy, though they're a lot bigger now than when I was there. But a company, so Heirloom Computing is actually a group of senior managers that came out of Microfocus about 11 years ago.
Okay.
These are people I've known for nearly 30 years. And our CEO was global head of development. Our CEO was the COO at Microfocus, and our CTO was CTO at Microfocus. And they were basically the cloud computing team at the time. And at that time, Microfocus decided to stop that. But these guys had a vision, right, of moving legacy applications. And by legacy, this time I'm talking about mainframe, specifically Cobalt and PL1 applications to the cloud. That's not just Cobalt code, right? On the mainframe, you have a KIX transaction manager, or you have an IMS transaction manager. You have data in various mainframe specific file formats, and that data is normally also encoded in EBCDIC, which is very different to ASCII. Right? And there are various other subsystems, security subsystems, third-party utilities, JCL, a job control language for running batch jobs, also exists on the mainframe. So when you talk about moving an application, almost the easy bit is moving code, right?
Yeah.
It's the other stuff that needs to move that is the complex, or that's where the complexity comes.
So we could say that it's very different from translating from one language to another, but remaining on the same platform. Like, I don't know, having translating code from Python to Java, but running on the same machine, because you don't have to translate just the language, but also in
The
a
platform.
way, yeah, of the platform.
Yeah, so the operating system utilities, or the expected utilities that exist on the platform. It's when you move from Windows to Linux, so maybe not now with Windows 10 and WSL2 and stuff, but 5 years ago, that was the difficulty in writing code. It used to be a joke in the early 2000s that Java, write once, debug everywhere, right? Because because the goal was that you'd have the same application running on Windows, on different versions of Linux, on AIX, and everything would work. And for a long time, I think until JDK 6, that probably wasn't a reality, right? They didn't have it integrated well enough into the various operating systems to make it work. But now it pretty much is, right? Even if you're doing file I/O, the Java file I/O works as you expect on all the different platforms, right? So
it took 25 years, but
yeah, yeah, right. But that's That's the way it is. And you know, to be clear, the reason I talk about Java a lot is, although we talk about ourselves as being a compiler company, you know, and that's really where we got to know each other. You're language specialists, you know, DSL language specialists, and we're focused on a couple of languages, and you're focused on the generalized, you know, approach to creating compilers, transpilers, interpreters, right? And you know, obviously, I followed your work with interest, and we've also collaborated a couple of times on various bits of work, right? And I'm sure we'll continue to do that in the future.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But definitely we miss your level of expertise on the platform, that I think it's a big part of these legacy modernization efforts. I wanted to ask, what are the problems that motivate your clients to modernize their software?
So you get various client drivers. Sometimes it can be that a CEO comes in. We have one insurance company in the UK where the CEO came in and said, senior managers, the KPIs, your key performance indicators are that 50% of your transactions have to run on the cloud. It's like, well, we're running on the mainframe. How do we run on the cloud, right? You know, and that's when they start to look around for, well, how can we move off the mainframe to the cloud? So it can be a fiat decision from on high. It can be a cost-driven decision. The mainframe platform has traditionally had high costs of ownership. They would counter that those high costs of ownership come with, and by they I'm saying IBM. So IBM would counter that, yeah, the mainframe doesn't have high costs of ownership because it never fails, it never stops, it never reboots, it always runs, it never goes down, you know. But you know, if you look at the bottom line, or if you look at the costs involved yearly running a mainframe, it's a significant budget item. So if somebody can come in and say, well, you know what, we can run that same application, we just take it, replatform it, and run it on standardized x86 hardware, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud, and it runs and it performs just as well, right? Then that's a significant cost saving. Now there are, as always, caveats to that, you know, but one thing to remember is that the mainframe was the original cloud, right? You know, they've got virtual machines on the mainframe. They've implemented transaction managers on the mainframe. Databases were created on the mainframe. We shouldn't denigrate the mainframe. They just chose the route of creating reliability by making the thing so that it never crashed, right? And that kind of gold-plated the hardware, gold-plated the infrastructure with the sole purpose that the thing will never crash and that transactions, you know, would be transacted and committed. And then the cloud has come up and it draws on a lot of those same ideas, but it provides a reliability using redundancy, you know, and the dynamically instantiating, you know, instances. So the cloud expects things to fail, right? And your job when you move to the cloud is to accept failure and just make sure that it works. I remember reading Kent Beck, he's working at Facebook, and he gave a talk and he said one of the things that really blew his mind was when he made a change and he committed it and he saw it ripple out, but only about 80% of the nodes received the change, right? And that was by design. They never wanted to get into a situation where every node was absolutely running every change. It kind of blew his mind because he'd spent years and decades ensuring that every node, right, you know, in a J2E or JE application server ran exactly the same version, right? But that becomes a single point of failure. It's a different approach, right?
Yeah, it is definitely require a change of mindset that maybe is not easy to do for the person that have worked 30 years with a certain system and can navigate very well and
Yeah.
produce great results with that approach to understand an approach that
Yeah,
seems very
that
different.
actually comes back to another reason people decide that they want to move off the mainframe onto x86 hardware. Another thing we often get is Cobalt to Java. I want to move Cobalt to Java, and we don't stress that too much. We stress moving the application and being able
Okay.
to make the application agile. But underneath, we do have a transpiler which emits Java code, which automatically gets compiled. But on our day one, we do a replatform and the application runs and behaves exactly the same way as before, because that's a way that we can bring the people with us, right? And the clients can bring their developers that have the 30 years, 40 years of business knowledge. They can move as well, right? Otherwise, you're going to get into a situation where you lose these people and you lose that business knowledge. This code is difficult enough, right? It's grown over 40, 50 years. It's got embedded corner cases in there that, in one branch office at one time somebody walked in that had a birthday on the 29th of February, right? So there's all kinds of corner cases embedded in that code base that are only known to those developers, and there's very rarely any tests, right? So that's not where you can go with it. And these people, they're getting in, they're either in their 60s or very close to their 60s, and they're getting close to retirement age. So that's another driver. A little bit of fear is coming in. We saw recently in New Jersey, the computer
Yeah.
systems fell over. And that has nothing to do with the language. That has to do with the fact that they have not invested in the infrastructure. The mainframe that they were using was never upgraded, right? The interfaces to that mainframe were never upgraded. And then it becomes a question, well, if you're going to invest money, are you going to invest it in mainframe tech, or are you going to invest it in newer technology, into cloud technology? And to their credit, IBM are adding a lot of containerization into the mainframe. There's many ways that you could stay on the mainframe now as well. I just don't think they're able to compete with Amazon or Microsoft, right? They're going to have to move some of their operations to the cloud. And I think they recognize that as well, which is why they purchased Red Hat and OpenShift. That gives them another entry point.
But you raise a very good point that there are these person that have a very important knowledge of the system, and they are typically COBOL developers, PL1 developers. And are they resisting to the migration to Java, or are they collaborating with the modernization effort?
So it depends how it's done. When it's a fiat decision from on high, nobody likes change, right? I'm not going to say all mainframe developers, but many mainframe developers don't see the benefit,
Mm.
right? They are working in a robust, reliable environment, providing transactional services to the business and to the clients. And those back-end services have been running for 30 years. Why change them, right? Yeah. So there is that large hurdle to overcome. Many times it's a question of showing and explaining, that their skills are not now going to be redundant. They still need COBOL developers. They still need the people that have the business knowledge in the future. This is an opportunity to learn something new, but from a comfortable position that you're the subject matter expert, right? And we're going to add a few things and we're going to provide other people, but you're still the expert, right? And so it becomes a question of pitching it correctly to the people, right? But change for change's sake, or let's move to a new platform, you know, they've heard it all before and they've seen the disasters. They don't want any part of that. With all people, there's a range. And it's not just mainframe people, it's all people. Nobody likes change. When things are working, nobody can really see the point of changing what's working. You've got to talk to people about agility, not just of the target infrastructure, which becomes more agile, more dynamically scalable, but also in terms of the development process, that the development process will need to change as well. The more I do this, the more I'm getting to the view that bringing the people with you, right, and taking care of the people in the migration is the most difficult thing of the migration process.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're experiencing the same when designing domain-specific languages. That it's a different topic, but also in that case, changing languages means also changing the way you operate, and means involving the people. And if you don't manage to involve the people, you can be as technically as good as you want, but you will not achieve your results.
Yeah.
So.
But I mean, it depends on the system as well. I mean, if you've got a system which has been static for 20, 30 years with the odd bug fix, almost certainly there aren't any people left who still understand it. Or maybe there's the one, right? You know, we've got a couple of clients where there's one person at the client and they're just scared stiff of that person leaving, right? Because then they know they've got a problem. But they also know there's only one person. You know, if she gets run over by a bus, right, we they have a problem, right? And they especially have a problem when it's on a mainframe and they can't easily recruit people to work on it.
That person should ask for a raise.
Yeah,
Probably.
we had one project in the States for a large insurance company, and we took it on, and it was very, very difficult. And then as we got into the project, we realized that we'd allocated 9 months, which we just made, right, for doing the migration. As we got into the project, we realized that a lot of it was undocumented, and it was actually a third-party product that had been bought in the 80s, and nobody in the company actually knew how it worked, right? So they had to go off and hire somebody back from that original company. And when she turned up, she told us that it had taken them 16 months to install the product, right? And that
Okay.
if they moved from one mainframe to another mainframe, she would have estimated a year. And we moved from a mainframe onto x86, actually onto AWS instances, right, in 9 months, right? So it was a great success, but it was unbelievably hard work. And we think the client deliberately didn't explain the complexity, or maybe they really didn't know, right? But it was an extremely complex application. The main reason was, as a standard product that was installed, a lot of the configuration was done in database tables. So the actual execution flow could not be discovered using our static analysis tooling, right? You needed the database. And those database tables, they had multiple schemas, and the execution flow changed depending on which schema you were accessing, right? Because they had the same table in all the different schemas, but with different data in. And so we'd make one run and it seemed to be okay. And then for us as outsiders, we'd make exactly the same run,
Yeah.
and we'd get completely different results, right? And it took us a long time to understand how the application was put together because there were no documents around it. The code compiled on basically day one, right? But actually getting the data over and the application running with the correct behavior took almost 9 months, right?
It's like you are unveiling old scenes that the company has committed for 30, 40 years, and maybe they even forgot or
Yeah.
someone managed to hide them for a while. And
Well,
now,
well. So Kix has something called background tasks, which can run. So when the Kix system starts, you can have startup tasks, and these can be incredibly important. They forgot to tell us that they had these background tasks. And so we were running the application for 2 or 3 weeks and not getting the right data. And we could not work it out, and single stepping through our debugger through thousands and thousands of lines of unknown Cobalt code, which used the database to direct execution flow. It was really, really tough. And in the end, we figured out, well, the data's not there. The data that you're expecting isn't there. And then somebody said, oh, maybe you need to run the background tasks. And oh, right, yeah, that would be great. And that was actually the reason Heirloom, we'd never done analysis as such. We'd always basically used our compiler to do an inventory analysis. Give us the code, we'll compile it. Oh, there's a missing copybook. Okay. But that single project forced us into a realization that our clients didn't know what they had, right? We spent a lot of time and energy now building an analysis tooling that will help us do a migration. And the very first thing it does is an inventory check. Right? So we now have this we call it blur process, where we run a service on the mainframe and we start an application and then we interrogate the mainframe. So if we can start with like a scheduler, right? On the mainframe, every JCL has got a scheduler. So we'll start with the scheduler for batch, and we'll get the list of jobs which are run. And then from that list of jobs, we download the JCL file automatically. We analyze the JCL file and we figure out what third-party utilities and what programs are being run. And then we go back and we get those Cobalt programs. And when we get the Cobalt programs, that tells us what other Cobalt programs we need. We build a graph up of all the relationships. And then we keep going backwards and forwards to the mainframe until we build up the packet, which is the application. And then we have a lot of information about the application stored in a graph database. And then we can make queries about that database and find the relationships between it. And we can go back as well. On the mainframe, there's a logging system called SMF, which records what applications, modules, what JCL jobs were run. It records all that information. So you get the SMF records out and we can feed them in to give us, and that combines kind of a static analysis with a dynamic analysis. And then we can see that, 90% of what you've given us isn't run. Of the 10% that you've given us, we're missing 5 programs, right? We can get all this information out, and we do that as part of, the estimation, the sizing, scoping of a project now. But that was all driven because we got surprised once by poor estimates.
while you were talking, I was thinking that is really important, particularly in this kind of project, to work with a specialist that had the possibility to learn these things over time. So when I think that is a field in which a company cannot improvise. You
No,
need a lot of expertise.
yeah, what we find as well is that we go to multiple companies and we do multiple modernizations from mainframe to cloud. You go into a company, and maybe not so much now in the last couple of years, but for a long time there was a bit of, I don't believe it can be done, right? So then you would get, and they'd say, we need to do a proof of concept. We need you to run a batch job, a JCL. We need you to run some COBOL programs. We need you to move the data. Actually, in the last couple of years, we're moving away from that because people now believe it can be done, right?
Okay.
So we don't have to prove that it can be done. But when we go into a company, every company says, but our mainframe is different. We've got some complex things. We use assembler. We've got a 4GL, and it's like the old saying: every happy family is happy the same way. Every unhappy family is unhappy in a different way. Well, every mainframe is unhappy or has its own complexity in a slightly different way than everybody else. But at the end of the day, there are core concepts in the mainframe world, and IBM have done an incredible job of documenting their environment. The red books are the gold standard. I wish our documentation was half as good as those red books, but that allows us to say we can replicate what you do on the mainframe. And unlike other people, we don't actually implement every subsystem of the mainframe. We actually just provide a thin transparency layer and let JE implement everything. We take security from RACF or top secret and we put it into LDAP. We take vSAN files or database files, IMS, and we put them into relational databases. We just try and reuse what's there and just do the minimum to make the program think it's still running on the mainframe.
Yeah, no, it makes sense because otherwise you're still trapped on this replicated system. But I wanted to ask, how do you typically work with clients? So what is the experience that a client has? How you start the engagement? What is the process for one to have a migration project with you?
So the key thing is our clients are financial organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They typically have global SI in place. We do smaller companies, of course, but the typical scenario is a global insurance company has an agreement with a global SI, Cognizant, Wipro, Accenture, TCS, or one of these guys in place. They will use the SI to do the migration. A migration is a complex project. So there's a global insurance company in the UK, and I don't know how much of this is public, so I won't say any names, right?
Good.
But they had a contract, and typically customers don't own their mainframe; they lease their mainframe off mainframe provider companies. They had a contract with one mainframe provider who drastically upped the price, and so they decided to switch to a different mainframe provider. And that project took about 18 months to complete. And that is moving from one mainframe to another mainframe.
Okay.
Right? I mean, they had a lot to do, a lot of interconnected stuff. And the people doing the work did a very, very good job. Right? Those leasing companies, right, are now actually a source of some of our leads, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're recognizing that their clients are going to come off the mainframe. We can now partner with them, just like we partner with the SIs, to offer their clients a way forward off the mainframe onto x86 platform, and they get to keep the client. And that's what the SIs do as well. If they come to like the insurance company and say, we can move you to AWS or Azure, and we can use Heirloom technology, then they get to keep the client. They get to do the migration and they keep the client afterwards. And that's quite valuable, right, to them.
Yeah.
And that's really our way. We have done migrations for clients directly, but our business model is to work through the channel, right? To work through the global SI channel. They're typically the incumbents or they have all the relationships, and we provide consultancy services to them and we provide our product to them. I don't think there's a global SI that is not a partner of Heirloom.
Hmm.
Right? That doesn't mean we've worked with all of them. We've got partnership arrangements with all of them. But the ones where we have worked are TCS, Cognizant, Accenture, and Wipro, right, for the large ones.
I think it takes some ability to look into the long term for who's providing the mainframe to understand that they need to not just to try to keep the selling the lease on the
Yeah,
mainframe, but
well, it's difficult, and we've seen that with a company in the US, one of those mainframe hosting services. They have top level management that have seen this approach and would like to do it, but they've not changed the incentives of their salespeople, right? And obviously, it's a much bigger ticket item continuing to sell mainframe, and
yeah.
inertia is, very powerful. Why do something if you don't have to, right? So the salespeople are still paid and incentivized much more to remain on the mainframe. So there's a strategy, there's a top-down, direction, but in my opinion, they still haven't managed to create the right incentives for their own sales force to make it happen in any big way, right?
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
easy to translate from strategy. Before you name the fact that you have products, can you describe what are the main products that Heirloom has?
I'll go really basic. We have Cobalt compiler, PL1
Mm,
compiler, and a JCL interpreter. Those are the three main products. We have an analysis tooling,
mm,
and we now also have ZData, which is a data connector back to the mainframe. So it's a service that runs on the mainframe. And with those four, what we can do is migrate data, and we migrate applications. So then we would deliver that as a development environment on Eclipse, right? So that you could start your Eclipse, install the Heirloom plugin, and then you can compile your Cobalt or PL1 code and debug it in Eclipse. But when we deploy it, we need to deploy it. The mainframe subsystems need to be in place. So our product contains transparency layers for the mainframe subsystems. For example, an SQL preprocessor
mm,
will generate in our environment JDBC calls. Right? So instead of going directly to DB2, now we have JDBC, which allows us to use any JDBC compliant database. We have a great partnership with Splice Machine, which allows us to create incredible clustering scalability at the database level. I think I mentioned security services. Security config gets mapped to LDAP configuration. VSAM files we can map to index files, which we don't tend to do, but we tend to move them into database tables. So the product palette is actually a development environment, where Heirloom SDK. It's migration analysis tooling, which allows us to do inventory analysis and data analysis so that we can migrate the data. And then batch processing system and KICS and IMS transaction processing systems. And then we can, depending what a client has, we can mix and match those products, right, as we go along.
Yeah, but it seems you have a very complete and holistic approach to all the different aspects.
Yeah, and there are lots of tools around that as well. I mean, in batch processing, there are a lot of IBM utilities for braiding connections to databases, which does some kind of file processing within a batch job. And we've implemented those utilities as well, and we've implemented them in Java. And we find that's key, because when we move we don't just move from one black box to another black box. We move from the legacy system, that closed system, and we put people on an open source Java platform. And then we can interact with any other JVM language and all these JVM subsystems that have been built up around Java. JDBC is one, you know, the Jazz security API is another, you know, that's all the things that we do, which kind of come to us for free and come to our clients for free, you know, and of course that translates then into doing some kind of nice things as well, you know, because it's Java, there's a huge community involved in Java that is containerizing applications automatically, right? You know, so you can now use Jib in a Gradle script to compile your application and containerize it. And that, as soon as it's containerized, you're now in Kubernetes and you can deploy the application into Kubernetes. And all that comes basically to Heirloom solution for free. It's not Heirloom that has to build it and provide it. The Java community provides those capabilities.
So once they completed the migration, they have access to all these huge ecosystem libraries, frameworks, and I think developers as well, because I guess that it's easier today to find Java
Yeah,
developers than Cobalt developers.
I mean, when you move the application, you've moved a monolith, right? Yeah, and now you're sitting with this. You've not made it any better, right? There's no magic bullet. If you had a monolith on the mainframe, you've got a monolith now sitting on Java. But what you can do now is you can use the capabilities, the agility of this development environment, right? And this huge development community, right? To start to change your deployment artifacts, you know, split up pieces of that monolith now into related functions and then deploy those related functions as a microservice. Without changing code, without changing business logic, you can actually do an incredible amount of re-architecting. And then, you know, you follow the Martin Fowler strangle the monolith kind of pattern, and you say, well, those services there are changing a lot, right? So let's put a facade over the top of it and let's start to rewrite. And you can do the rewrite you could continue to do the work in Cobalt if you've still got those Cobalt people or PL1 people, or you can do the rewrite for that small subsection in Java or Kotlin or Scala or any JVM language you want. You know, that's and you can, you know, you're running on the JVM now, so you can actually integrate with your other JE applications. And you've moved the data. The data on a mainframe is, even if they've opened it up and it's accessible, it's still sitting there in EBCDIC. So for you to consume it, there's a translation taking place, which can go wrong. You know, if you're dealing with packed decimal fields or yeah, there's lots of things to go wrong. So if you can define it and move it once, you can debug that once, right? Now it's moved and you don't have a translation anymore.
From our conversation, it seems to me that as a side effect of this migration, you also unveil a lot of interesting information about the application and the different components. So that I think would also help later the clients to do some evolution, some reorganization of the application, because you have reconstructed the state of the application as you needed to do that.
Yeah, and it's a key thing. We always talk about day one, and not the Amazon day one, but day one for us and for our clients is the day when they move the application and they re-platform it onto the Java platform, which means now that's day one. On that day, they've got exactly the same look and feel. We produce HTML with CSS to make it look like the green screen, right? You know, we execute the JCL as is. They can run their JCL exactly the same way. That's an underappreciated part of any mainframe application, the JCL. JCL contains logic, right? It's not just Cobalt code, right, that gets moved, or PL1 code that gets moved. JCL has to be moved as well, and that contains logic. What's really cool about that is we've recognized that many of our clients would like to do that and move the application, right? And there's some parts of the application that maybe are actually not that many mainframe applications are buggy, to be honest. You know, they've had lots of years of user testing, right? But they might have some parts of the application that change on a regular basis due to regulation changes. And they would like to modernize that small piece. So day one, we move everything as is. Day two, we talk to people about, we unveil information about the application, and we can talk to people about re-architecting just by changing the deployment configs that we put together. But we're also adding to our plugins and adding to our editor ways to refactor and extract out facade interfaces to enable that business logic now to become available, simply available to the JVM. We actually automatically do that for Kix transactions, right? So every Kix transaction becomes a callable web service in Heirloom. If you take a Kix application with a set of transactions, you can now script that set of transactions. And we've done some demos and shown people how they could create Angular or React front ends, completely new JavaScript only, Node.js front ends, which interact with the Kix application running on a JVM somewhere, right? And we've done that quite a lot. You know, many of the clients love to see that because it gives them a way to break the green screen approach. It's not always the right thing to do. I mean, a data entry terminal with a green screen, I don't think there's anything faster than that, right? You know, if you've got an experienced data operator inputting onto a green screen, honestly, that is probably the fastest way to do things. You know, the first time they touch a mouse, right, that slows them down.
We had a similar experience when developing domain-specific languages because many clients want have the ideas that they want a graphical language because they perceive will be simpler. What we do sometimes is say, okay, we will give you a language that you can use both in a textual form and in a graphical form, and we basically, when you edit once, we behind the scene edit the other ones. And after a while, people stop using the graphical one because they realize that with the textual one, they are more productive. So I think you have a similar scenario in this, that maybe they have the perception that your interface is better, but it's not necessarily the case.
You know, when we're coding, right, they use Eclipse, IntelliJ, or VS Code. The pragmatic programmers said it best. They said you should pick an editor, learn it, and stick with it. And by learn it, they didn't mean, you know, how to cut and paste. They meant learn the depth of that editor, because as a coder, as a developer, you're going to be sitting in that space for 8 hours a day, right? And you don't want to be clicking up on a menu item to do a compile or to save a file. You need to have the control keys in your memory. You know, it has to be in your physical memory. Good programmers always have an opinion about what editor they like to use, right? It's one of the things I look for if I ask somebody, you know, at an interview what editor they use, and they use Notepad, it's almost like
not a good sign. I personally am obsessed with the idea that we should use tools that improve what we are able to achieve, and indeed the company I founded, Strumenta, means tools in Latin just because of this. I think we stole already 1 hour of your time, but and there are so many topics
Yeah.
that I would
Well,
like to dive in. I wanted to ask you if there is something that you would like to add that I forgot to ask, but you think it's important to.
no, really. I mean, we're on the lookout for good people, right? So, I think like everybody, but no, I think the legacy modernization space has really come of age, right, in the last few years. There are many ways to do this, to move forward and modernize. We think we have, Heirloom has the best kind of hybrid approach to it, but there are many ways to skin the cat, and our clients, I think, respect the fact that we don't just go to them and say, oh yeah, you have to do it this way. We will go into a client with an open mind and see what's best for them. I spoke with a large bank in the UK 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I told them they should stay on their mainframe, right? The complexity they have and the capabilities they have today, I don't think are easily replicated. But that was because they'd written their own operating system almost 40, 50 years ago, and that was still existed. And the risk to move that for a bank is just too great, right? You've got to accept and view where risks are, right? And I would say that we come into every engagement. Obviously, we want to sell our skills, but we also are specialists here. We've seen clients, and everybody's afraid of risk, and we do everything we can to minimize the risk. And if that, for some clients, means that they don't even do the move, then so be it. That's
Yeah, because otherwise, anyway, you will have a client that is unhappy. So
yeah. I mean, we've had some difficult projects, right? I think everybody has, but we've never had a failure, right? And that's I don't think every company in this space can say that.
yeah, and I think it's your very deep experience that you have also demonstrated today. I think it's something that permits you to understand the risk, because I think that maybe other companies willing to do legacy migration could either minimize the risk to take the job, and that's sad, but in some cases maybe are just not able to understand all the risk, because it's very complex thing to do. I think it's already assessing the difficulty of this project is something that requires a lot of expertise. Yeah.
That is where I think our greatest value add comes in, at that front end, right? We can talk to clients and we can go through their landscape right at the beginning, and we can work with them and the best projects are when we've worked with the client right from the beginning and worked on the business analysis and the business case together, because then we've been able to see, well, do the numbers add up? Does the risk add up? Okay, let's move forward or not, right?
I think it would be also useful to have the right people on the client side to have this
Yeah.
exploration.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to thank you very much for the
Well,
time you
thank
have
you.
dedicated to us. It was very interesting for me, and I hope for all the people listening. And yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thank you.
Always a pleasure chatting to you, Federico.